Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Denver Foundation's briefing on the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund. I'm Desa West, Vice President of Community Impact at the Foundation, and on behalf of the Denver Foundation, I want to welcome each of you. We're so happy to have you all here with us today. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive in. You can probably recite these along with me with all of the times that we've been on Zoom webinars at this point. But this session is being recorded, so if you don't want your lovely face recorded, please feel free to go ahead and turn your camera off. You'll be muted during the presentation portion, and we ask that you use the chat feature for questions. We'll have several panelists speaking, so if you have a question that's for a particular panelist, go ahead and indicate that when you're typing your question into the chat. That'll help us make sure that we get it to the right person when we're having our conversation later in the session. So we have 4 speakers today, all of whom are wonderful, and we're very pleased to be able to introduce to you. The first is Javier Alberto Soto. He's our president and CEO here at the Denver Foundation. And the second is LaDawn Sullivan, who is the director of leadership and equity here at the Foundation as well. We also have 2 other members of the Denver Foundation family. And I wanted to make sure just to give you a little bit more background on them. Our first guest is Javon Brame, who was born and raised in Colorado and grew up in Park Hill, where his parents stressed leadership and responsibility to community. Javon earned his BA in English from Langston University and his MA in higher education from the University of Denver. He currently serves as the Dean of Students at Arapahoe Community College. Javon is also the immediate past chairman and former grant chairman for Denver African American Philanthropists, which is a giving circle at the Denver Foundation. So welcome, Javon. We're really happy to have you here with us today. Our second guest is John Loewy, who is an attorney living in Denver. He is a graduate of Miami University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Law. John's held a number of government positions, including Special Assistant to the White House Office of Energy Policy and Planning. And since relocating to Colorado 19 years ago, John has taught public policy at the University of Denver and has served as a board member for several nonprofit organizations. John is a donor-advised fund holder with the Denver Foundation and the current vice chair of the Denver Foundation's Board of Trustees. Welcome, John. We're very happy to have you with us as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our CEO, Javier Alberto Soto.
Thanks very much, Desa, and thank you all for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about a journey that goes back 25 years at the Denver Foundation. It's a journey that started 25 years ago when our former CEO, David Miller, put us on a path towards addressing racial inequality at a time when very few, if any, philanthropic leaders across America were focused on race and inequality. This 25-year journey has brought us to what is clearly an inflection point, not only for our community, but for our country. We're at a moment of polarization, pandemic, and a renewed focus on racial equity. So what will we do with this inflection point? Will we prove our resilience, or will we continue to be divided? Will we be completely torn apart and fail to protect the great American experiment? Yes, there's an urgency to these questions, and this urgency of now has led the Foundation to reimagine our role in helping to create a more just, equitable, and resilient society. That's why, after years of visioning and planning, the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund was launched on Juneteenth this year. As a pandemic raged across America, inflicting a disproportionate toll on communities of color, and outrage at yet another Black man being killed at the hands of someone with real or imagined authority was unleashed, we felt the moment had arrived to launch this movement. It's a movement that seeks to bring Black philanthropy, Black leadership, and Black voices together to attack systemic problems that have brought us to this very inflection point. The urgency of now requires us to have ambitious goals for BRIC as a vehicle for local impact and also as a model for other communities who are focused on racial equity. We're looking carefully at how best to position BRIC to achieve these ambitious goals, but there's one thing that's crystal clear. We need your help. We need your partnership. We need your support in order to be able to achieve all that we seek to do. So I'd like to now roll a videotape that gives additional background information before we launch into our panel discussion.
Uplift what we need to do going forward so our kids can be free, so our grandkids can be free, so we won't see lynchings again, so we won't see police brutality again. That's why we're here today.
Juneteenth is a celebration of steps, centuries of steps toward equality, toward making America what it has always claimed to be. That first step out of bondage in 1865 to the steps of today of the protesters in the streets, up the steps of the state capitol, to where Colorado's governor signed historic police reform today, a law brought about by the sound of footsteps from protesters outside. It seems more American eyes are on this Juneteenth than any other. If they're looking at Colorado, they see a state responding rapidly to long-term concerns, spurred to take those steps by the names we now know.
Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Jamal Floyd, George Floyd.
A Juneteenth celebration of steps taken and steps to come.
So we will stand with our community to the end, till we get the justice that we need, till we get the freedoms that we need, till we get the liberation that we need. We'll be right here fighting for our communities.
Colorado is taking a $1 million step today toward addressing one aspect of systemic racism, the way the world of giving works. Nonprofits, where a nonprofit leader recently said that Black nonprofits get tested while others get trusted. Arnusha Roy talked to the Denver Foundation about its $1 million idea.
It's been in the works for a long time.
The problem of systemic racism is too big for just one organization to solve. So the Denver Foundation established the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund.
That would support communities of color, especially those led by Black professionals that are serving Black and immigrant and refugee communities.
Wow, they see us.
It is a simple but profound reaction from the executive director of the Center of Trauma and Resilience.
When you don't have access to wealth, you are overlooked. It is absolutely not what you know, but who you know.
You know, they're oftentimes disconnected from traditional philanthropy and from other sources of revenue.
Well, I think it happens because we aren't at the table.
We can go back, especially today on Juneteenth, we can go back 155 years and beyond to answer those kinds of questions.
I would agree with that.
It was the last couple of months with COVID-19 disproportionately impacting minority communities in Colorado and the recent wave of civil unrest as the country reckons with racism that gave impetus to this fund.
Our resources at the Denver Foundation are finite and are not sufficient to solve these deep systemic problems in our society. But they can be catalytic.
It's definitely not all that we need, but it will make a difference.
So the Denver Foundation is now opening this up to the community. So far, they have about $500,000 in donations. They're hoping to reach $1 million within a year, and they're going to be opening up these applications in the middle of July. And Kyle, they said they're going to be giving these grants out on a rolling basis.
Have they talked to Nusha about how they might divvy this money up, or you could divide $1 million ways, a bunch of different ways?
Yeah, so basically the grants are going to be anywhere from $5,000 to $25,000 increments. And Kathy, who you just heard from in the story, said, you know, on the higher end, a $25,000 grant could help them launch an entirely new program and find a way to make it sustainable.
All right. We will certainly keep an eye on their work. Anusha Roy, thank you very much.
So with that as background to set the stage for this conversation, I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, LaDawn Sullivan, who serves as Director of Leadership and Equity at the Denver Foundation and is the quarterback of this initiative for us. LaDawn?
Thank you, Javier. And so happy that so many are joining us today on this call for such a time as this. This is a culmination of, as Javier said, this has been a 25+ year journey. And I would like to just take a moment to just give a little bit more detail about how we got here. So back in 1997, and I was at the foundation at the time, the Denver Foundation decided that it was going to root community in the Denver Foundation. I mean, it's a part of who we are. We are a community foundation, and what better than to have community be at the center of the Community Foundation. And the first step in that journey was our Strengthening Neighborhoods program that responded, I would say, very quickly and proactively to creating intentional space for community members, not necessarily nonprofits, but directly community members in those communities most greatly affected and vulnerable to actually lead the change in their community through supports of small grants, but also I would say what we call relational connection with the foundation and us utilizing our skills as conveners and gatherers of community leaders of all different types to be able to inform and implement and evaluate how they were going to actually mobilize change in their communities. Building on top of that a few years later, the foundation decided, as Javier said, you know, when you're talking about racial inequality, often the first place you go is diversity. You're head counting how many people of color are in the room, and you're not moving into a space of intentionality, into inclusion, how you're actually creating intentional space for inclusive conversations and decision-making and elevating people's lived experience and valuing that in a room where those decisions that will directly affect the communities, those voices are actually heard and they're a part of the decision-making. And that work really led to what we are doing most recently with what we're calling the Landscape Project. The Landscape Project was kind of a look back, looking at the work of Strengthening Neighborhoods, looking at the work of the Inclusiveness Project, almost 20 years in the making, and determining, have we really moved the needle? Have we actually created deeper engagement, deeper acknowledgement and intentional space for community leaders? And we're actually moving away from, you know, again, that head counting of who's in the room, but actually creating inclusive decision-making tables. And that work continues now in our first year of what we're calling the Landscape Cohort, where we have invited 9 white-led organizations and 9 Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations to actually work on their internal practices, work on their internal policies to become more racially equitable, to become more inclusive, to ensure that they're actually engaging the communities that they serve, and that they're actually connecting in a way where the community is leading their efforts to make them more impactful, to make them more effective, to make them more efficient. Coupling all of this work together, I would say, the thread between it all has been the foundation's intentional build into its DNA of listening and being responsive and being connected and responsive to that listening. And I would say also really strengthening our servant leadership, where we're walking alongside and even behind and being in a space to step in and utilize our influence as the community directs us to, as they see spaces in which we can leverage our power and influence, as well as elevate their power and influence. And one of the unique ways that we have been connecting and I would say being supportive of leaders of color in particular has been through our Executive Directors of Color Institute, which is in its 9th year. We have over 125 alumni of this program, 40 folks that are participating this year. And that, that program has created a space for leaders of color to not only build their individual leadership skills as they navigate the world of the nonprofit sector, as well as playing kind of an intermediary between their community and their nonprofit work, but also elevating their organizational capacity so that they can be more effective and more impactful. And as they have stated, better prepared for what is before them as they take on the issues that the communities that they serve identify. Then I would say finally, and kind of in right alignment, about 9 years ago, we, the foundation did again some listening, but also I think on our own journey of looking at how we could better strengthen our skills and of inclusion and equity, we recognized that we needed to create intentional space and actually lift up what we know to be true as a part of the history and culture of communities of color and their giving. And so our Elevating Philanthropy in Communities of Color work really began to take shape. And we have, later you'll hear from Javon Brame, who is one of the members of Denver African American Philanthropists, which is one of our first giving circles as a part of that work, where we are recognizing beyond treasure, beyond the financial resources, the ways in which communities of color have forever been able to mobilize and create the change that they wish to see through their time, their talent, their treasure, and their testimony, and their social ties, utilizing that collective force to actually create change in their communities, as well as bridging into, I would say, the larger work required to actually create systemic change in our country's systems. So with that being said, that kind of sets the stage for all the things that set us up beautifully for this moment, for the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund. I often talk about this moment right now of this fund's establishment of being a combination or a recipe of all the things I mentioned: strengthening neighborhoods, the Inclusiveness Project, our EPIC work, EDs of Color, and our landscape work, and add to that 2 pandemics. And in some ways it was those were the last 2 ingredients, those last 2 pandemics were the last 2 ingredients that brought us to this moment. The establishment of the Black and Resilience in Colorado Fund. And we recognize that it's built on, it is built on the input, the love and the leadership of the Black community, but also these community appreciative approaches and practices that have been seeded, rooted, and I would say grown to great maturity of the Denver Foundation and how it connects and works with community, beside community, and sometimes behind community. Finally, I'll just add just a couple more things about BRIC itself. As we said, it's 7 weeks old, so I would say it's ever evolving. But as you heard in the clip, this fund initially is designed to support Black-led and serving organizations, and it's leveraging the leadership development and organizational capacity opportunities that will help the Black community, these organizations, and the larger Black community to move from surviving to thriving. And it is, again, the manifestation of a collective investment of those 5 T's: time, talent, treasure, testimony, and social ties. Just a few more things about the BRIC Fund, and then I want to invite my other 2 guests, my co-guests, into the conversation. Just a little bit more about BRIC. As it has quickly evolved, there are 5 things that I talk about concretely about what really will be, hopefully become rooted in BRIC. Again, that it will support Black-led and serving organizations' efforts to act on community-identified critical and emerging needs and issues, that it's going to continue to build individual leadership skills and organizational capacity so that the nonprofits that are supported by BRIC can be more effective and impactful, that it will continue to elevate and expand the practice of mobilizing resources, those 5 T's, beyond just the financial resources, but really be connected to the root of the giving DNA of the Black community, of being able to mobilize those 5 T's. Also, to strengthen efforts to increase racial equity across all the sectors, including philanthropy. We recognize that as we're working to be supportive of these Black-led organizations and Black leaders as they mobilize in the community, we also see direct correlation with connecting with larger entities, like-minded organizations like the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, so that we can work in partnership to address racial equity and actually be a force in addressing systemic change. And then finally, I'll just say, as BRIC has been established, and we've been mentioned a couple of places in the news, as you saw on the video clip, and in the Chronicle Philanthropy, we have been contacted by other similar or like initiatives and funds. And we recognize that there is a great opportunity for us to connect across the country together, one, to share and learn from each other, but also to hopefully create a collective agenda that will help us all achieve the goal of supporting Black communities as they move to, as I think one of the ladies said in the video, to a full space of freedom, justice, and liberation. So with that, and as I don't think we actually mentioned this, but the BRIC Fund has been in place or established for 7+ weeks. And we have been very fortunate to be supported by several of our local foundations, corporations, and donors. And I have 2 donors joining me here today, 2 of our BRIC Fund donors. And so I'd just like to invite Javon and John to the conversation. So good to see you all in the little boxes to the right of my screen.
Good to see you too, LaDawn.
Good to see you. So Javon, I'd like to ask you first, how did you get involved in DAAP?
Yeah, so I am actually in the first group who was not in the founding group of DAAP to join the group. And so I'm a millennial. I'm 32 years old. And as my bio said, born and raised in Denver. And so I saw this group that was having a significant impact in our community. And I really wanted to get involved in that group. So I knew a few of the gentlemen who were working in the group. And so I attended a meeting actually hosted at the Denver Foundation where they had hosted the Community Investment Network to begin to come into the community and talk about disrupting traditional notions of philanthropy and talking about the different ways the Black community has traditionally engaged in philanthropy, even though we haven't used that name or that title. So I joined the group shortly after that meeting, and it just have been going ever since. And I have enjoyed getting to work with this group of amazing African American males. You know, our current chairs are Brandon Bruce and Haroon Cohen's. our former chairs were Raymel Blackwell and Charles Guilford, and I got to serve as the chair before them. And I'm just glad to see that we're continuing to have this, be able to have this impact. And I'm really excited to see where we go from here.
Thank you, Javon. And of course, we've known each other for quite some time, so we could talk on and on. But I also want to bring in John. I want to make sure John is in our conversation. So John, you're currently a trustee at the Denver Foundation. Could you share with us your first connection to the foundation?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And I also want to thank you for including me in this panel. It's quite an honor. And it's part of the reason, being with people like you all is one of the reasons that I've continued to increase my involvement with the Denver Foundation. I was a board member of a small nonprofit in Denver called Denver Scores, which was an after-school program for third to fifth graders. I believe we were in about 8 DPS schools. And it combined soccer, which was somewhat of a passion of mine, and creative writing. It was a really innovative and neat program. The connection to the Denver Foundation was through Social Venture Partners, which made a grant which really enabled Denver Scores to expand its programming. And it also provided technical assistance in the form of a couple of the partners from Social Venture Partners who came and sat on our board and really helped sort of catalyze the work, provide better systems, a tremendous amount of technical assistance, and that was really important. Through that and continuing relationships, how things go as you meet people, you start getting involved in things and you're networking. I ended up opening a donor advised fund at the Denver Foundation a few years later. Again, met more people at the foundation and became more and more interested. And I've continued, what is it, nature abhors a vacuum. I had some time on my hands as I was approaching and then in retirement, word I don't like to use all that much. And became more and more involved and ultimately had an opportunity to serve on the Board of Trustees. So it's been a great journey. I've learned a tremendous amount. I've met some wonderful people, and but that's the short form of the story.
Awesome. So even though both of you have come to know the foundation from 2 very different vantage points, but if I pose this question to both of you, how did you get connected to the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund, and maybe just expand a little bit about why it's important to you? Either one of you can go. Javon, just go ahead and go.
All right. We're playing popcorn here, right? So, our giving circle, Denver African American Philanthropists, started having a conversation around COVID-19 and how we were going to respond as Black men in our community. It's really important for us to be on the supply side of philanthropy and being able to give to our community, empowering ourselves, right, to see this change that we really want to be a part of. And so we were having this discussion, and I remember talking with Raymel and Charles and Brandon, and we really need to respond. And I actually ended up having a conversation with LaDawn, and LaDawn had a lot of different ideas for the ways that we could begin impacting this. And she had been talking about the idea of this Black fund or Black, almost, grow into something bigger idea in the long term. And so, what we were saying, what better time than now? And so, it was really important to me that DAAP, be a leading voice in this conversation as we are Black people, and the pandemic and, the social inequities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic are greatly impacting African Americans in the Denver metro area. And so we said, let's go back to the circle and talk about what we can do. And we decided to leverage $10,000 from our fund to try to get this effort off the ground. And our members were very supportive. And we're looking to see how we can continue to engage in this work, because, you know, we're really just in the beginning, and we haven't even really started to see the long-term implications of this time. And so we have to keep going, and we have to set bigger goals, right? And as it's been said in our community, $1 million is not enough, right? We should be shooting to raise $1 billion. So, you know, I'm looking forward to that continued effort.
Yes, Javon, I like your numbers. John, how about you?
So as a trustee, I like those numbers also. I'm interested in how we'll raise them. I guess there are a lot of reasons, but I would cite two. The first one is it's a project which empowers a community. It's not dictating to the community what the solutions are. It's set up to allow those solutions, those approaches to be developed at ground level. And those are the best approaches, I think, especially dealing with social problems and the problem of race and racial equity. I was a VISTA volunteer in 1969 through 71 at another interesting time in our history. But one of the things, and VISTA was, for people who don't know it, part of what was called the War on Poverty. It was also sometimes called the Domestic Peace Corps, but you spent a year or two working in communities. But one of the things I took away from that experience was just that our job was to come into a community, do what we could to help organize, but basically when we left that community at the end of the year, we disappeared. I mean, there was no desire to have anyone remember what we had contributed, but that we left behind local capacity to address local issues. My second year in VISTA was in Cleveland, Ohio, and believe me, there were plenty of issues in Cleveland in the late 60s and early 70s around race and racial equity and injustice. The second, I actually wanted to quote Mackenzie Bezos. I don't know how many people quote her, but she said recently in making a major multi-$100 million grant on racial equity, she said the people who have the experience with inequities are the ones best equipped to design solutions. I really believe that's true, and I believe the Denver Foundation believes that's true, and is how this is operating. The second thing for me is allyship. What does that mean? Boy, you could get a lot of definitions, and you could get a lot of discussion around what is an ally? Do we need allies? I think everybody needs allies, and they need the right kinds of allies. Nita Mosby Tyler, who was our board chair, quoted a teacher of hers when she was young, who said that justice requires an accomplice. So I think that I have an opportunity to be an accomplice, to be an ally, and to try to make some progress in dealing with the racial equity issues, realizing that even though I have a background in government and trying to develop public policy and doing all these kinds of things, issues around race, come on, I don't have the solutions. I barely have the questions, but I know people who do have the solutions, and I know where those solutions are located, and I'm excited to be able to support it.
Thank you, John. Javon, I saw you nodding your head when John was talking about allyship, or I really saw you nodding when he said accomplishment. Did you want to add a comment there?
Yeah, John and I, so, when we were engaging in our conversations prior to this, we really talked about that, right? And what it looks like to move from allyship to accomplishment. And I think that is what his gift to the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund has done, right? It moves from a place where dominant populations or white people are saying, we really don't know how to fix this, and we maybe should not even be at the forefront of fixing some of the challenges that we have in our society, but we have the resources, we have the power, and we have the privilege to begin empowering this shift in our society. And so, and I argue that even people of color who have attained a certain level of power or privilege within our society have to begin equipping people who are on the ground levels with the resources to engage in this transformation that our society really needs to move forward.
Right. John, I think you also mentioned something, and I leave this to you and or Javon to chime in. When you were, you said you were a Vista, or you were doing some work abroad, and then, but you were there for, in some ways, a moment, but you were also kind of inciting a movement. And so just for both of you, and you're thinking about BRIC and maybe its future, or what it could evolve to be. I mean, I mentioned earlier, like, we're 7 weeks in the moment, but what do you all see as the potential movement of BRIC and its work?
I don't have a great answer for that, except to say that, I think things, scaling up is a concept where you start small and then you kind of see how things evolve, and you make adjustments as you go along, maybe shifts in approach, and then you are able to scale up the project up to the $1 billion that Javon talked about, from the $1 million that we're talking about. So I think there's a lot that'll be learned from experience. And also, of course, the talents and focus of the people who will be working on the project. So I wouldn't prejudge, where I would think it would go, except that if it does well, I think it will grow, and it'll learn from its own experience, and have more and more of an impact in the community.
Yeah, I could really see, this growing into a much larger initiative within our community, right? Where we're continuing to empower Black people to have an active voice and active role in the solutions for our community. And we have models for this in Denver, right? We've seen what's happened with some of the other community foundations and, our Brown accomplices in this work. And I don't think we should stop any shorter than that for the African American community and the Black people in Denver. We're a much smaller segment of the population, but some of that has happened intentionally, right? Talking about some of the challenges in our community related to gentrification or urban renewal. We've had an exodus of Black people, especially from when we're talking about the 7-county Denver metro area. And so directly addressing those challenges, I think that's where we will continue to see the growth in this work as people see that impact. And I also see the work of the Denver Foundation leveraging its privilege, right, as the largest community foundation in the Rocky Mountain region to establish this initiative, but then it also at some point stepping out, right, and saying, we have given you or provided you with the platform to stand on your own.
Thank you both. So I guess I will pose this question to both of you. What is your message to donors who are considering giving to BRIC? So, we've talked about like what could be, we've talked about where it might go, but we all also know that it takes a myriad of resources to support growth and change. And so what would you say to donors within your circles and beyond?
Well, fortunately, in preparing for this, I have another quote, actually from a new book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And she says, and I quote, "Each time a person reaches across caste," and there she's making an analogy to race in this country, referring to caste in India. Each time a person reaches across caste and makes a connection, it helps break the back of caste. Multiplied by millions in a given day, it becomes the flap of a butterfly wing that shifts the air and builds to a hurricane across an ocean. So I guess my response would be, everything that anyone can do helps. There is no single contribution that is going to solve the problems of race in America or in Denver, but engaging, and then, you know, not just engaging financially, but paying attention and thinking about what we learn as this project goes forward. What we learn are ways to begin to address the systemic racism that, you know, that exists in Denver and in this society. Pay attention, read, think about it more, open up your thinking. I think they all go together. So that would be my comment.
Thank you, John. Javon.
Yeah, so, you know, I have begun tapping my friends working all across the country who are from Denver, were born and raised here, but are working in DC and, you know, involved in different opportunities, and saying, hey, your community needs you and we need you to contribute to this fund. You know, Black people in Denver need you and we need you to contribute to this fund. And so that has been a lot of my message. And I was reading the comments in the chat, and I believe that it was President Obama who said, and he talked about the strong urgency of now as he was being elect or nominated as the Democratic candidate. And I always point to that, like, this cannot wait. I was on a call about diversity and inclusion before this meeting. And, you know, we were talking about shifting people's minds and shifting their ideas, and how that can be or long-term work. And yes, it can, but we also have to think about the people who are suffering while it's taking a long time to shift people's minds and ideas. And so I say, when you're thinking about, or when you're talking to people about giving to this fund that's benefiting Black people in the metro area, I draw to that strong urgency of now. And there are people on the other side of this institution, or on the other side of this structure, that cannot continue to wait. Their lives are literally hanging in the balance in some cases. And so I just encourage you to think about the people. You know, this is the work of people and changing lives. And as we think about disrupting traditional philanthropy and engaging in those T's that LaDawn is talking about, the time, talent, treasure, testimony, you know, think about how you can leverage what you have to be a philanthropist and make a change.
Great, thank you. And Javon, I'm gonna pick on you just for one moment more, because you actually are serving on the BRIC Advisory Committee. So do you want to expound at all about, well, we've had one meeting, but just expound about your experience thus far, and connectivity to being in a voice of leadership in this work?
Yeah, so I really take this seriously, you know, and you know, whenever, like, there are kind of these structures that are set up, you know, where people are representing their community or serving on behalf of their community, you know, I take that very seriously, in that, you know, it's not just about my voice, right? And sometimes you see me and, you know, you get this kind of polished idea of a person, but there's so many pieces there of me that I hope to bring to that space that are representative of the larger community. And so I'm really happy to be serving, and glad that we get to lead the work from a place of, you know, of community. That's really what this is about. And so I'm excited about that.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. I know we have a lot of questions in the chat, and I think somebody is helping us manage that. So I would say maybe in these last few moments, we'll open it up, and then before we go to our closing remarks. So.
Hi, Desa again. I'm the person that's helping to manage that. And what I'll say, LaDawn, is what we have for the kind of entire first part of that comments is just huge props to DAAP, to you. There was a call out to Vista volunteers, and then a really interesting conversation about allyship and accomplishment and how that relates to white supremacy in the sector. So there's some good just dialogue that's happening. So I'm going to read the first question that I've come across, which has kind of a comment to it. So I'll read this out. It says, I think it's difficult to have Black people's voices included in true and equitable ways because the nonprofit industry is inherently hierarchical. So most of the time, the Black people represented in this data or are giving their input are not necessarily diverse in education, class, and age. So this makes me wonder, who are the folks reviewing the applications of this initiative? And are they truly representative of those in the soft white underbelly of the Black community here in metropolitan Denver representative?
So, okay, I guess I will take that, and Javon, I would encourage you to chime in as well. So I know they put up a slide of the people that are on the advisory committee. I do want to say that we have taken into great account what we have been hearing. We, as I said, the Denver Foundation has become well practiced in listening, and so we have talked to leaders of Black leaders of nonprofits directly, Black leaders of emerging nonprofits, leaders of groups that don't have their 501c3s, folks in the community who have ideas and are looking for some type of support, whether it be monetary or I would say more of a one-on-one coaching. And that really has informed, first of all, the application itself, but secondly, the way in which we, meaning the advisory committee, will be reviewing and making recommendations to approve the first set of grants. The advisory committee was painstakingly, we have stayed connected deeply in the community for years. And I'll just say, at least from my vantage point, one of the criteria that I thought hard about as we began to think about who were going to be the inaugural committee members were those who are working hard in the community. Some are unseen. People don't necessarily know who they are, but they have a street credential in the community that is sound. Folks who have worked side by side, sometimes especially with organizations who have struggled to survive, especially more recently with both pandemics, with what's happening in the community, talking to folks in the community about who they trust and getting, I guess if you want to say, better understanding of the folks who now serve on this committee and how they have worked and have a track record of working hard to represent the community that they're a part of as Black community members in the metro area. I also want to say too, taking a lesson from the Denver Foundation, this is a work in progress. We recognize this is going to be the first grant cycle, and we will be listening to those who will receive a grant and those who do not, because we want to continue to ensure that community voice is helping to drive every aspect of this work, of our grant making, of our connectivity with community partners, of the programs like Executive Directors of Color and others that will now be deeply connected between BRIC and the Denver Foundation as we move forward. We recognize community voice is a part of the DNA of how we will operate. Javon, I don't know if you want to add anything as a committee member.
Yeah, I think anytime you have like a systemic practice, right, that's talking about disrupting systemic racism, there's always kind of going to be this push and pull. And I think it's really just the reality of what we're dealing in. I work in education. And so being a Black male who's working in education, I have to acknowledge that I am, I hold a position of power within a system that oppresses my people, right? And so I have to constantly be thinking about that in my mind in disrupting or dismantling that system, right? And rebuilding it in a way that adequately serves the people. And so I actually see my engagement with the BRIC Advisory Committee in the same way, right? I am there to have a lens to say, is this still perpetuating the traditional notions of philanthropy that, you know, do not adequately serve our community. And I feel like that is very much so represented for the folks that are in the room. But there is also a piece of, yes, needing to bring the people we're serving's voice into the room. And we're gonna get very creative to figure out ways to actively do that, right? Not just talk about it, but actually do it so that we can have the impact and community that we want to have.
Great, thanks for those answers. We have a question from Eric that is about two things that I think foundations think a lot about and funders think a lot about. And the two things he's asking about are what types of technical assistance are going to be provided to grantees, and what are the data reporting requirements? What are the things that we're going to be asking grantees to have them talk to us about impact? How does that look through the fund?
Okay, like I just want to reiterate, we're a work in progress. But I will tell you at least where we're starting. As far as technical assistance, again, being available as people apply to help them better understand the application and or to talk through how they think they fit and to answer their questions will certainly be a part of how the process, you know, as when the request for proposals opens up, that opportunity will be there, as well as some proactive outreach from myself and others who will help guide this process. And then whether an entity, a group, or organization receives a grant or not, we've established a strong practice, and I believe that this will also remain in BRIC, to offer opportunities, what we call relational TA, which is access to folks who have expertise in certain areas, or to help them be connected to people who have expertise. We want to elevate the practice and the value of sharing and learning, creating opportunities for leaders to connect with one another and to be able to share their own specific expertise in areas. And that kind of also pivots into our continued connection and work with the executive directors of Color Institute and our alumni of that program. There are amazing leaders who are a part of that work, who look forward to sharing what they've learned, as well as reaching out to learn from each other. And folks connected to BRIC will also have those types of opportunities to ensure that they're connected. As far as data that we'll be asking for, there are some specific questions that we're asking. Our initial first grant cycle is focused on general operating support. We understand, we have heard from Black-led organizations that it's something that they are less likely to receive when they've gotten traditional grants through foundations and other entities. And so we want to ensure that we're also listening to them, but then we're going to be asking questions about what they did with the dollars, how it impacted their organization. We're asking them to talk to us about how they're connecting with community and how community voice is directing the work and the path where they see their work going. And we're going to hopefully, at least virtually at first, create spaces where our community partners through BRIC can come together and share and learn from each other and be able to share directly in small groups and in larger groups, so we can better understand how we can be better, provide better supports, and maybe even be proactive on things that bubble up to become themes of ways that we can help them build their capacity.
Excellent. Well, we're just getting warmed up. It looks like we should have had a 2-hour session from the questions that are starting to come in. we're actually out of time. We need to turn the mic back over to Javier, but we will, in our follow-up to you, provide answers to the questions that we weren't able to get to in the chat today. They're great ones about streamlining applications and what other kinds of programming BRIC might offer and supporting leadership trainings. So lots of really good, thoughtful, meaty questions, some of which that we'll have an answer to, and some of which we'll say, still a work in progress. We're still thinking about it. What do you think about this? So thank you all for all of your engagement today. We really appreciate you being with us. We appreciate all of the support, and I'm going to turn it back over to Javier for some final comments.
Great, thank you, Desa. And I totally agree that we could have and perhaps should have, in hindsight, made this a lot longer than an hour conversation. But hopefully it's just the start of a dialogue and a conversation around how we can all work together on these issues that we're so passionate about, this community that we care so much about. Now, I want to close just by commenting briefly on the power of generosity. You know, communities of color don't get a lot of credit for being philanthropic, but they're among the most generous communities in America. When you look at, in terms of percentage of income, the most charitable zip codes in America, more often than not, they are communities of color. In South Florida, where I'm from, Opelika, Florida, a small municipality in Miami-Dade County, is consistently ranked as #1, the most charitable community and zip code in Miami-Dade County, but also one of the most charitable in the nation. Opelika, Florida has a population that is 98% Black and Latino. So that power of generosity, I think, has always existed in our communities. And I think the problem that we need to solve for is how we turn that deep generosity into a bridge that builds sustainable philanthropy that can then power and ignite this work in perpetuity, frankly. And so that's what we are really focused on at the Denver Foundation and with this initiative. But as I said at the beginning, ambitious goals like that can only happen if we have your commitment, your support, your partnership. And so we'd like to ask directly for your support of the BRIC Fund. And to further ignite your support, I'm pleased to announce that the Denver Foundation will match all individual donations up to a total of $50,000 during Black Philanthropy Month. So there will be a slide in a moment on your screen that will direct you to how you can give and support this initiative. But please do reach out if you have any questions, or if you'd like to talk about this further with myself, with LaDawn, with Desa, with any of us on the team. We invite your partnership and participation. And again, thank you for your support, not just today, and your participation, not just today, but for your long history of support for our community and for the Denver Foundation. Thank you so much.